To spank or not to spank? That is the question. Hi, my name is Raquel Perkins, and this is my final presentation for my persuasive speech. My topic today is obviously to spank or not to spank. Now, there are three areas that we're going to be covering within my presentation. The first is, why is spanking still a traditional or a traditional and acceptable way of disciplining? 2, what does some child psychologists say about spanking? And 3, what are the appropriate ways to spank a child and what are the inappropriate ways to spank a child? So let's get started. Now, when we say spanking, what do we mean? What is the definition of spanking? According to the dictionary, spanking is the act of striking the buttocks of another person to cause temporary pain without producing physical injury. Now, that's very important because when you're spanking a child, you definitely do not want to cause physical injury. Okay, now generally spanking involves one person striking the buttocks of another person with an open hand. So when you're spanking with an open hand. Now when the open hand is used, it is commonly referred to as smacking or slapping. So you're slapping the buttocks, or they call it smacking the buttocks. Okay, now more severe forms of spanking is switching, which is using a piece of a branch or a piece of a tree, which is switching. I remember that growing up, we used switches. And paddling, using a paddle. And in schools, they would often use those. And we would call those getting a whooping. Now, belting, now that's what I remember, and that's what I have used to spank my children, which is a belt across the buttocks. Okay, so why is spanking still a traditional or more acceptable traditional way of disciplining our children? Now, according to Dr. James Hobson, who was a psychologist and also a pastor, he says that there are other effective ways of disciplining your child besides spanking. However, spanking is still a very resourceful and useful tool for child rearing. Now, in the United States, we know that the United States believe in biblical principles. A lot of our laws and the very foundation of the United States of America was built on biblical principles. Although sometimes that there are different interpretations of the Bible, it appears across many cultures that spanking is still and seem to be the acceptable form of disciplining. Spare the rod, spoil the child, the Bible says, and tells us in Proverbs 13 and 24. Well, what does that mean? Spare the rod, spoil the child. Some people take that to mean a literal term. Well, if you spare the rod, if you do not spank your child, you will spoil them and they will be spoiled. They will be undisciplined. Okay, and again, that is left up to interpretation. But this is one of the reasons why spanking our children is still a more traditional and acceptable form of disciplining. Now, spanking can be an effective way of disciplining children, I believe. If it's administered within boundaries, it can be an effective way of getting change in that bad behavior. Okay? When children are openly defiant and disrespectful, the punishment must fit the crime. Spanking sends a strong message that the bad behavior will not be tolerated and that there are severe consequences for that bad behavior. Spanking also establishes the levels of the different levels of discipline. A child should not be spanked for everything that child does. Obviously, after all, the child is a child, and we know that children are very curious. Children are going to try things, and they're going to try our patience. But as parents, we are the teachers. We're the ones that are supposed to effectively communicate to our child that this behavior is not acceptable. And so spanking really should be used as a last result, but not out of frustration. After you have effectively communicated with that child that this behavior has to change. And if it doesn't change, then you're going to experience the consequences of getting a spanking. So it's very important that we effectively communicate to our children. Now, spanking also establishes, again, levels of discipline. We definitely want to remember that. Okay? I remember my mother telling me stories about her growing up. Now, in the African American community, spanking is used. It is a highly effective tool that we've used in the African American community. However, when my mother was growing up, I remember her telling me that, you know, parents or adults didn't explain anything to children. If you did something wrong, you got a whooping, is what they called it. And for an adult to try to explain something to a child, that does not, it never happened. But as time went on, we learned in the African American we learned in the African American culture that communication is very important. So we need to communicate to our children to understand why they're getting a spanking or a whooping, as we called it. Now, we must understand that spanking teaches the child that there are consequences for their actions. For every action, there is a reaction. Children must know that pushing the envelope too close to the line has its consequences. Okay? So next I want to talk about what is the wrong way to discipline a child. Okay? And so if you could just turn your attention here to my visual aid, this is a picture of a woman spanking her child. Why is this not a good way? Okay, this is not a good way to spank a child because she is grabbing the arm of the child, and if that child turns the wrong way, she could, you know, twist that child's arm out of socket. She could cause some severe damage to that child's arm, and that is not what we want to do. You see that she is striking her on the buttocks, which is fine, but that's not the proper way to spank the child. Okay, so we definitely want to remember that. Now, smacking a child with an open hand across the face, that is not a good way to discipline a child. You definitely do not want to do that. The proper way to spank a child, okay, is to lay that child either on the bed where you can spank that child on the butt with the open hand, or you are seated and you lay that child across your lap and spank the child that way. That is the proper way to spank a child. Okay? So let's talk about what some psychologists say about spanking. One psychologist says that spanking is an effective form of discipline when administered between the ages of 2 and 5. These are the most impressionable years, okay? And any hitting after the age of 5, some psychologists say, can lead to emotional and mental and social disorders. Now, my own personal thought is, I believe that you could actually probably go up to the age of 8. I know I did when disciplining my children. But psychologists believe that between the ages of 2 and 5 are the best time to administer spanking, and that's when the child is most impressionable, or when they really learn their right from wrong. Some psychologists believe that spanking should not be administered at all because, one, okay, they believe that it is just abuse to actually hit another person, and to hit a child is completely wrong. So some psychologists believe that it's just abuse. Some psychologists believe that you should not hit a child at all because it sends the wrong message. It can do more harm than good for the child. They believe that the child may think that that is the way to take out their frustrations, is by hitting. They also believe that it can confuse the child as to love and evil. And here again, I feel that this is where communication is so important. You have to effectively communicate with your children. I understand what the psychologists are saying as far as causing some confusion, but as a parent, okay, when you are raising your child, it is up to you to effectively communicate with that child and let that child understand that, yes, I love you and I am spanking you not because I'm angry. I'm spanking you to teach you a lesson. And you have to understand that your action has a consequence. Okay, when we do not effectively communicate with our children and we use spanking for everything, and we use spanking to deal with raising our children, and that's the answer for everything, yes, I can see where it can be abusive and it can be harmful. But I believe that most parents love their children and that they want to raise their children and teach their children the right way. So I do believe that spanking can be an effective tool if done in that particular order or within those guidelines. In my conclusion, I just want to share that I was spanked as a child growing up. And I, like a child, there were some times where I was confused about it. But I understood that there were lessons that I needed to learn. And because my parents effectively communicated with me and really pointed out the areas where, okay, you were disrespectful here, blatantly disrespectful here, and you were wrong here, I understood that. And so when I had my children, one, I wanted to communicate with my children. And I've given my children 3 or 4 chances with effective communication. And then by the time when they got a spanking, they understood, you know what? I understand why I'm getting a spanking. And that is very important. Okay, so in closing, I just want to say that I do believe that spanking can be an effective way of disciplining your children in child rearing Now, it can be if it's done within guidelines. There is a fine line between spanking and abuse, and as parents, you have to watch that line. Okay. Also, parents should never discipline or spank their children out of anger or frustration. And again, psychologists say the best time to spank your children is between the ages of between the ages of 2 and 5. Well, that is my speech, and that's my stance on it. I do believe that spanking can be an effective discipline tool for children. Thank you.